Chapter 42, The Body Knows First, July 2021. The first sign that something was wrong came from my body. I was in training to become a peer support specialist, trying, in some small way, to turn pain and survival into something useful. I knew trauma. I knew loss. I knew what it looked like when people kept going long after their systems had been overwhelmed. What I did not expect was to become physically ill while listening to other people speak. Most of the participants were in recovery from substance use disorders. I was not. My recovery had nothing to do with drugs or alcohol. It had everything to do with what had happened to me. What happens when a nervous system is pushed beyond its limits and never allowed to come back down. As people shared their stories, my stomach tightened, then bloated. A dull pressure spread through my abdomen, nausea, cramps, the unmistakable feeling of being unwell. I shifted in my chair, breathing slowly, trying to ground myself. The sensations didn't pass. I wondered if it was something I'd eaten. Then I noticed my breathing. Shallow, fast. The body was speaking before my mind could catch up. I had shared piece of my own story before. I knew how to listen, but this was different. The discomfort followed me home and stayed through the night. When it returned the next morning, stronger, faster, I understood that something was demanding attention. And then it clicked. What I was reacting to wasn't the substance use stories themselves. It was something underneath them. A tone I had heard before, an attitude I couldn't yet name. Tough love. I had heard that phrase from them at some point, and it was clearly the most inappropriate response to tragic and traumatic loss. Yet that was what the response to everything had felt like. My life had changed catastrophically more than 20 years earlier. Suddenly, traumatically, I had tried to explain what had happened again and again to my parents and my sister. Each time it was as if I were speaking a foreign language. There was no curiosity, no emotional response, no sense that what I was describing mattered. I understood the difference because I had seen it elsewhere. When I returned from my wedding ceremony in November 2010 and told my second wife, Ellie, that my dear friend Thomas had died, her response was immediate and human. Her voice softened. "I'm so sorry. I know you were close." That was it. Nothing dramatic, nothing performative, just recognition. Years earlier, when Lynn, the woman I loved and lived with as husband and wife, became critically ill, I told my parents and sister about the terror, the grief, the fear that she might die. I waited for something similar, concern, empathy, a simple acknowledgement of how devastating it was. It never came. I can see now how abnormal that was. If a hurricane tears through a coastline, people assess the damage. They offer shelter. They bring food. They understand that survival comes first. What I endured wasn't a natural disaster, but it required the same response. Instead, I was met with something else. Not concern, not care, not recognition. Tough love? What I needed was compassion, understanding, empathy. I needed a human response. I can't believe I let them poison my mind with the notion that there was something unnatural about my reaction. What was wrong was the absence of care. No one assessed the damage. No one said, "Of course you're not okay." No one offered shelter, time, or protection while I tried to recover. Instead, the chaos compounded. Within months, I was facing homelessness. My mind jumped ahead to a year later. By then, I had been living with David and Quillpen. They knew I needed help. They also knew they couldn't keep me forever. They wanted my parents to understand what had happened, to see that this wasn't laziness or failure, but the aftermath of sustained trauma. We were on the phone at the same time. I was in one room. Quillpen was in another. I heard her pleading with my parents to understand what was happening. She warned them about the man who had targeted me, someone so charismatic and manipulative that, as she put it, if John said the sky was pink, I'd believe that's what I was seeing. She was talking about John F., who had become obsessed with me, a con artist, con short for confidence, someone who manufactures certainty without evidence. Months had passed since my lawyer had gone to trial with no phone records in a case where John had fabricated a story about harassing calls. I had been found guilty without evidence. None of that seemed to register. At some point, I heard Quillpen's voice change. She thought she had hung up. I don't think they care at all about Bruce, she said. That sentence landed cleanly. There was nothing to argue with. Not long after that, I was working at an Eckerd Drugs in Durham. Normally, I worked in the photo lab, 1 or 2 customers at a time, simple exchanges, contained, predictable. That day, I was placed on the main checkout line. The line stretched back into the aisle. People shifted their weight. A child cried somewhere behind me. My vision blurred. My hands shook. I tried to slow my breathing. A young woman stepped forward and handed me her driver's license to purchase alcohol. I stared at it. The numbers wouldn't settle. They slid out of focus and then snapped back. Wrong. I tilted the card under the fluorescent light, blinked, tried again. I looked up, scanning for a manager. I can't do this, I thought. I can't focus. I reasoned with myself instead. She wouldn't hand me an ID if it wasn't valid. I waved the card slightly, still looking for help. The customer walked away. A manager saw her leave and called the police. I tried to explain. I told them I had been looking for help. I told them my vision had gone blurry. I told them I was overwhelmed. None of that mattered. The citation that followed spiraled into something far worse. I missed the court appearance, not out of defiance, but panic and confusion. I woke up one morning and realized with horror what day it was. Oh my God, court. That was the first time I saw the inside of a jail. I called my parents for help. I was terrified. Jail was unimaginable. They told me they couldn't afford it. Later, I learned they had purchased a new dining room table to impress friends. I couldn't imagine what had been wrong with the one they already had. It was worth more than anything I'd ever owned. Appearances mattered more than their son. Not long after, I was extradited back to Wilmington, shackled, chained, treated like an animal for another failure to appear on an appeal I had pursued on principle. A public defender had failed to gather phone records. I had demanded accountability. The cost was humiliation. This was not met with outrage, not with concern, not with softness, only confusion about my reaction. What's wrong with Bruce? That question echoed through years of trauma. In therapy, I would eventually process more than 50 distinct events, each one a punctuation mark in a long sentence of ongoing harm. Complex PTSD is not a single catastrophe. It is what happens when trauma continues without relief, without protection, and without emotional response. What I've described here barely carries us through late 2001. There was so much more. During that training weekend, I met someone who had survived Munchausen syndrome by proxy. A parent had poisoned him and then presented him as ill. I asked if he would be offended by an analogy I was wrestling with. I wasn't physically poisoned, I said, but my family, my sister and my parents, made me believe my normal reactions were signs of sickness. He understood immediately. That was the moment I realized my body had been telling the truth all along. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't failure. It wasn't something wrong with me. It was the cost of surviving without support. To understand how I reached that moment, I have to return to where the work actually started, back to the intake, back to the room, back to 2018.